I can't get there to say continue.
Hi.
Beth, when you do the intro and the housekeeping, you could tell people this is being recorded.
Okay, I can't move around. I don't,
You can't advance the slides?
I can't move anywhere. I can't, this thing says this meeting is being recorded. I can't get rid of it.
Yeah, you can't get rid of what?
There's a thing that says this meeting is being recorded right on top of the screen.
Oh, okay. Well, you just need to click on that.
I
saying
know,
it's okay.
if I could click on it, I would.
Okay.
I cannot do that right now.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Deborah? I mean, Beth?
I'm
John
Marshall from the Ethical Society of Philadelphia. Could we ask everyone to mute if you're not one of the presenters? Could everyone mute, please?
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
Is Beth still here?
Yeah,
Okay, Beth, why don't we get started?
okay.
James, they're getting started. Oops, I should.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Beth Reeves, and I am with POWER Interfaith Lancaster County and Lancaster Friends Meeting. On behalf of POWER, I want to welcome you all to this briefing and discussion. We're so happy that 60 people have joined us to find out more about the lawsuit that will make Pennsylvania school funding more equitable, racially just, and adequate enough to provide enough to real opportunity for all Pennsylvania school children, and to talk about how POWER can continue our work to get fair funding legislation passed. There's a few housekeeping requests. First, please, right now, type your name and your organization or congregation and location in the chat. If you're here as an individual who supports racial justice, that's wonderful too. Just type your name and location in the chat. So the PowerPoint that's used tonight will be available to you later, so you don't really have to take copious notes. And we're also recording this session, so that will be available too. The agenda tonight is John Barnett from POWER Metro will lead us in an opening prayer. Deborah Klehr from the Education Law Center will discuss the lawsuit. And then she'll then take questions. So please type your questions in the chat.
Put on this meat, which is very expensive, and then you're letting it burn up.
Could everyone mute, please?
So if you type your questions in the chat, John will read them and we can have a question and answer session. Next, Rochelle Nichols Solomon from POWER Philadelphia will talk about POWER's next steps and introduce a time of small group discussion about those steps. She'll ask a recorder from each session to take notes on key ideas. After we have those small group discussions, we'll gather again briefly to discuss the key ideas for our next steps. And finally, Rochelle will read a poem for closing faith grounding. So John?
Thank you, Beth, and thanks for that nice welcome. I'm John Barnett from POWER Metro out in Chester County. I'm just about to introduce our speaker, Executive Director Deborah Klehr from the Education Law Center. But before I do, I'm charged with some faith grounding. I've brought a prayer for us from the Jewish tradition with the intention of invoking peace for all of us from any tradition and any faith. So as I start, let's just have a few moments of silence. Oseh shalom b'mromav, huya aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'emeru amen. O maker of peace in the heavens, grant peace to us, to all the house of Israel, and to all the world. O Lord, whom our ancestors called maker of peace in the heavens, be with us and bless us in our quest for peace. Help us, O source of peace, to find true peace in our lives and with our neighbors. But keep us from a peace of complacency or a quiet of false security. Help us, O source of peace, to labor for peace in our community, in our nation, but keep us loyal to our convictions as we seek to reach out to others. Help us, O source of peace, to strengthen the hands of those who work for peace in our troubled world, and strengthen our devotion to freedom and our dedication to justice for all. Help us to welcome truth from whatever source and to sustain hopeful spirits at all times. Help us from being prisoners of precedent or hostages of habit in thought or deed. As you have taught us to love peace and pursue it, grant us, we pray, the blessing of lasting peace. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Executive Director Deborah Klehr. Deborah is the Exec Director of the Education Law Center, a nonprofit legal advocacy organization dedicated to ensuring access to a quality public education for all children in Pennsylvania. Deborah brings extensive expertise on education law and policy issues, including fairness in school discipline, fair funding for public education, and other school access and improvement issues. Deborah joined ELC in 2005 after clerking for U.S. District Court Judge Raymond J. Deary in the Eastern District of New York. Deborah has taught education law at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Her article, Addressing the Unintended Consequences of No Child Left Behind and Zero Tolerance, Better Strategies for Safe Schools and Successful Students, was published in the Georgetown Journal on Poverty Law and Policy. She is a frequent speaker statewide on education policy and the law. She was selected for and served on the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's Juvenile Court Procedural Rules Committee. She previously taught kindergarten and first grade in Hoboken, New Jersey. Deborah is a graduate of Princeton University and Harvard Law School. She serves on the Pennsylvania Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and was recently elected to serve as a member of the American Law Institute. Deborah serves on the board of directors of both Jewish Family and Children's Service of Greater Philadelphia, and is a board member of Congregation Rodef Shalom, which is a POWER congregation. And I'm very happy to welcome Deborah to tell us about the trial of
Thank you, John, so much. I'm trying to screen share. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. And now I think I can even do this so you don't have to see all the side. All right, you just see the one slide, right? Thumbs up?
No, we see the front slide and then we see next slide in a box.
Oh.
It's like your note page.
All right, well.
Now we don't see anything, but
right.
That's okay. We could go back to that.
I think it worked well. Or are you trying to hold us in suspense for the next slide?
I'm not, well, I don't think you really want, well, hang on. Okay. Sorry, everyone. This will be, we'll try to minimize the,
And while Deborah's doing that, Nathan, just so you know, I keep getting pop-ups that people are in the waiting room, so I just keep admitting them.
Okay, yep.
Okay, I don't know
That's the
why
way
I'm
to do it.
getting it, but
Yep.
I'm getting it. Okay.
Okay, all right.
how about now?
Deborah, no, we don't see anything right now.
All right, well,
Try one more time.
okay.
Yeah. Okay, now it says that you started. And we see the deck. And if you go to slideshow, start from the beginning.
I know,
Yeah,
but then you get,
try it.
okay.
I wonder.
It's okay. It's okay.
Deborah, I think if you go to the display settings, there's a thing you can toggle. Yeah, that one.
How about now?
There you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Is that Amy? Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I'll talk fast and we'll make up the time.
Yeah, and you, okay.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for having me. I'm Deborah Klehr, the Executive Director of the Education Law Center. Sorry you had to suffer through both a really long bio and tech problems, but I'm really pleased to be here and grateful always to partner with many of you individually whom I know and with POWER more generally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the background that got us where we are, which I think will be old news for some of you, but maybe new information for others, and then get into the nitty gritty of our trial, suing the state for failure to fund public education under the state constitution, which starts October 12th. So how did, we usually start, and you'll see in the corner, Public Interest Law Center and Education Law Center, because these are the two organizations that have brought this lawsuit. And so I'm presenting tonight, but it's lawyers from both organizations who are doing all the heavy lifting, and I have the pleasure to work alongside them. So again, I'm sure you have heard this before, but the pandemic certainly, we filed this case 7 years ago. But we start sort of with the pandemic because, the pandemic really laid bare the longstanding inequities that have been there, but really crystallized for some, and certainly for the media, these stark differences. And so, it takes resources to respond to these crisis situations. And it was quite clear, even right at the beginning of March 2020, that there were districts who could pivot and districts who couldn't because they didn't have the resources. And it did disproportionately impact our Black and Brown students who are disproportionately attending underfunded, under-resourced schools. And so we saw that at the very beginning, and we continue to see that as schools, some kids are starting for the very first time now, having not been in school since March. So what's the long-term problem? Again, I'm sure many of you know this, but the long-term problem is that the state of Pennsylvania does not have a goal of fully funding our schools. So they don't. They have a constitutional obligation and defining what that means, we'll talk about a little, but they do not interpret that at this point in time to mean that they have to fully fund our schools. And there's a relatively low state contribution. So we'll talk about this more, but schools are funded by the state, by the local, and by the federal, small amount from the Fed. And in most states, the state provides the majority of the funding. In Pennsylvania, it's flipped, where your zip code, your local district is, and local taxpayers are supporting the schools at a disproportionately higher rate. So most of the funding, we have a fair funding formula, which I know many of you, if not all of you, know a lot about and have been really helpful in advocating for that formula. But most funding that the state sends out to schools are not based on that formula. And so as a result, our low wealth communities who need the most try the hardest. They have really high tax effort, but fairly low tax capacity, and they have the least funding in which to support their schools. So what does that mean? How do we rank? Not so well. We're 45th in the nation. And so we are close to the bottom in terms of state share. What that means is that most of our funding is coming from local governments. In Pennsylvania, it's 38% total revenue from the state, 59% of total revenue from local governments, and a small percent, 3% from the federal government. That's 18-19 numbers. And yes, there will be a teeny bit of a spike for all states because of COVID dollars from the feds, but we'll talk about that too. It's not gonna move the needle in the long run. And so I think, you know, the takeaway from this is to know that, you know, we're ranked 45th in terms of our state share of public school funding. And what that means is that we are overly reliant on local education funding in Pennsylvania. And that leads to disparities. So this is just one school district. I know you are from all over tonight, from all over the Commonwealth, but Delaware County, which is outside of Philadelphia, for if you don't know, has districts that are really poor and districts that are quite wealthy. And the point of this slide is to show that a district like Marple Newtown or Radnor Township with a really high tax base, really high property values, tax themselves at a pretty low rate, but it generates a lot of local dollars. A school district like the William Penn Area School District, which is our named petitioner in our fair funding case, taxes themselves at a really high rate, 34.6, so much higher than Marple Newtown or Radnor. But because their property values are low, it doesn't generate very much money locally. In a more progressive state, the state would make up that difference and give quite a bit more to make sure that William Penn School District has what it needs, where it can't do it on its own the way a Marple or Radnor can. So I'm just gonna put it all out there for you. The point in comparing these two school districts, so you've got New Hope and Reading, two school districts, one relatively high tax base, one fairly low. And yet again, you see New Hope, wealthy district, taxes themselves pretty low rate, 12.6. But that generates a huge amount of money, $25,000 per child. Think about what that means in a classroom. And so the state gives them, mute that, all right. The state can make up with the state provides them with a little bit of money for $4,600, but they have $30,000 per child. You look at Reading, they're taxing themselves at a really high rate, but it doesn't generate much money. It's an incredibly poor district. And the state, while relatively, it's more dollars than what they're giving to New Hope, but it's certainly not anywhere near getting Reading to what it needs to provide an adequate education to its students. And then you see that total, the bottom, 13,256. So it's a huge difference. And again, multiply that by a classroom, by a district, and we're seeing huge disparities. And so this is both inadequate, okay? Reading doesn't have what it needs, and it's inequitable. Look at that difference. And, just to dive slightly more into it, you look at the two districts and you see huge differences in students in poverty and English learners. And the takeaway there is that, in a fairer distribution, school funding would flow to the students and districts based on what their needs are and what they actually need to serve their students. It costs more in programming and resources and to serve the needs of English learners and students living in poverty. But that's not how we fund schools in Pennsylvania. And so our lawsuit charges that the state is responsible for covering this gap between the resources students need to learn and the resources their communities are able to raise. A little bit more on background. So we talk about 1991 being the year that everything gets frozen. Frozen in time, how the state views districts kind of stopped in 1991. Before 91, we had a formula that looked at characteristics of the district, whether it was a growing district, whom, what students the district was serving, numbers, etc. And then we stopped. And so what the state gave you each year since then is based on what you got the year before. Not based on what your actual student needs are, what the characteristics of your districts are today. And so the disparities grew. And the disparities have, continued to grow in terms of what our wealthiest school districts have and what our lowest wealth districts have. What were we doing about it before we, parallel, what were we doing about it? And I'm using the royal we because power was, played an important role. We advocated for the fair funding formula, which was finally enacted in 2016 and does take into account district need. So how many students are in poverty, how deep of poverty, et cetera, number of English learners, and other factors that have to do with the district, like tax effort and tax capacity. Are you a William Penn area school district that's taxing yourself at a really high rate, but you can't generate the dollars locally? That's a factor in the formula. But that formula, which was a political negotiation, was only focused on the distribution of whatever money was sent through it. And a formula is only as fair as the funding sent through it. So that formula was about splitting the pie, not how big the pie should actually be. The legislature did not use this as an opportunity to determine what do districts need, what do students in those districts need. They just said, of any amount of money we decide, this is how we're going to distribute the money. And so that's, there are huge strengths to that formula because it did finally take into account, poverty. To create a weighted student formula, it took into account the characteristics that we thought were important, but weakness is that it really just distributes whatever money you have. So that was one. And the other, which again, I know Power knows well, which is that it only applies to the funding after its adoption. So anything that was distributed before 2016 is still distributed in that way, no matter what that district looks like today. So it's about 14% of current funding that runs through the formula. And so that's, leaves about 5.65 billion still distributed in the pre-2016 way. And about $900 million since the passage of the formula, so about 14% going through the formula. And this creates a Hunger Games situation where we're only distributing really small increases through the formula, and so the only way a district wins is if another district loses. We need to grow that pie and redistribute it fairly. But if all we're doing is redistributing an insufficient amount of money, we're not going to get to where we need. And so we talk about the problem as, I always talk about pie, but how big is the pie, and then how is it distributed? Because if you're just focusing on distributing a small pie, you're not getting your districts and ultimately your students what they need. And similarly, it doesn't help to grow the pie and spend a lot of money, but not send it out in an equitable way. So we talk about the hold harmless problem. By freezing everything pre-2016, sending so much money out, the way it was, what should we spend this year? Well, whatever we spent last year, without taking into account, has that district grown a lot? Does it have many fewer students now? What do our poverty numbers look like? It's a huge problem. And so if we scrap that hold harmless practice of distributing funds based on, and sent it all through the formula, it'd be great for low wealth district who suffer. You look at York City and you see how much they would get if you just redistributed this amount. There's a but coming. But I think, it's important to see sort of the huge numbers that we're talking about. And by the way, these are districts whose students' needs aren't being met, and the districts aren't spending what those students need. They don't have the dollars. They don't have access to the dollars. They may be taxing themselves at a really high rate, but they can't generate that money locally, and the state isn't giving them what they need. There's another problem to hold harmless, which is that just redistributing everything, because it's this Hunger Games zero-sum game, if you don't grow the pie, you have districts who may themselves not be at adequacy, not have what they need, losing quite a bit of money without taking into account where, what the specific needs are in that district and whether they're at adequacy. So rather than saying who is more deserving of a too small pie, it's really about growing that pie and redistributing it in a more equitable way. So, we say there's not one, so you can't just redistribute. And when you grow it, that's when, we need to be redistributing it. And so, if you just redistribute this too small pie, just using William Penn, again, one of our named petitioners in the lawsuit, it would get them $931 more per student, which they need, and that's not enough. They actually need $4,836 per student just to get to adequacy. And so I think it's really about changing the dialogue completely in Harrisburg and getting the legislature to focus on growing that pie and redistributing it in a more equitable way. And it's our belief that they could do this even without a lawsuit, and that perhaps a lawsuit will give them just the incentive they need to actually, finally, adequately, and equitably fund our schools.
What I used to, when I turned.
So why does this matter? Well, I think many of you know this, and that's why you're here, because even before COVID, and you've been advocating for fair funding because you know that our students don't have what they need. And as a result of underfunding, again, this is pre-COVID, June 2018, this Inquirer article, you see leaks in schools, asbestos in schools, lead paint harming our children, facilities, technology access, counselors, class size, art and music. Students were not getting and still are not getting what they need because the districts don't have the funding they need from the state. So one way we measure also is, looking at test scores. And so this, you can see our Money Matters, and students attending underfunded schools are not college and career ready and don't have access to what they need, and the scores show that. If you don't love standardized test scores and you want to look at other measures, you can look at college attendance. Students in districts with less to spend graduate and attend college at much lower rates than wealthier districts. And opportunity gaps abound. So Pennsylvania has larger gaps in student outcomes by race and economic background than almost any other state. And our funding system is failing our Black and Brown students and our poor students. This next slide comes from your own David Mazenkis, who, I think about this slide, keeps me up at night, because what this graph depicts is that each Pennsylvania school district, by its level of poverty and how much state aid it receives. So it shows a couple of things. In Pennsylvania, the amount of state funding a district receives generally tracks with the level of poverty in the district. And that pattern is reflected by this dotted line. The higher the level of poverty in a school district, the more state funding you should be receiving. But it also shows that Pennsylvania has glaring racial disparities in its funding. So the blue dots are districts with the most white students, and the red dots are districts with the most students of color. And for any given level of poverty, percentage economically disadvantaged, you see that a district with more white students is likely to get more state aid than a district with fewer white students. And the red dots are concentrated below the dotted line. So the districts with the most students of color get less money than you would expect based on their level of poverty. So what are we doing about this reality in Pennsylvania? and this reality for so many of our students, we're suing the state. And we filed a case in 2014 in Commonwealth Court, and we have two claims, adequacy and equity. And what that translates to in legalese and constitutional speak under the Pennsylvania State Constitution, the first is our education clause. So every state has its own education clause. We call this a thorough and efficient. The General Assembly shall provide for the maintenance and support of a thorough and efficient system of public education to serve the needs of the Commonwealth. And this case is about putting some teeth into what that actually means. What does thorough and efficient mean? And we will be showing and hoping that the judge is convinced by all of the evidence to show that the state is not meeting this standard. And then we also have an equal protection, the equal protection provisions within the Constitution. So again, it's about how big is the pie and how is it distributed. And we are bringing this case again, well, on behalf of school districts across Pennsylvania, so rural, urban, and suburban. This is not just a Philadelphia problem, this is statewide. And we're bringing the case also on behalf of two statewide organizations, the NAACP State Conference and the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. And in addition, on behalf of parents. And so while the Philadelphia School District is not itself a petitioner, a parent from Philadelphia and her students are involved, and that allows us to bring in evidence from the School District of Philadelphia as well. So who are we suing? The respondents are the state actors responsible for the state funding system. So it's the leaders of the Pennsylvania Senate and the House of Representatives, the governor, the State Department of Education, the State Board of Education. And so while the constitutional responsibility lies with the state, the head of the Senate and the head of the House, because anybody who's involved in solving this problem is party to the suit. So those are the respondents. What are we doing? We are asking the court to declare the current broken system of school funding unconstitutional and direct the legislature to create a constitutional funding system. The legislature needs to increase the amount of money provided by the state to schools, and they need to ensure that additional funds are driven to districts serving students who have the most significant needs. So it's both. It's both how big is the pie and how are you distributing it. I think it's important to say that we're not asking the court to order a specific amount of money, and we're not asking the court to come up with the specific way to distribute those dollars. We are asking her, the judge is Judge Conjubilier. We are asking the judge to order the current system unconstitutional and order the legislature who has that constitutional responsibility to fix it. And so parallel to our argument in court is a really important piece, which is making sure the legislature is primed to know how to fix it when they're ordered to do so. And so I know Rochelle will be talking to you and others will be talking to you about what that means and how you can play a role in advocating with the legislature. And by the way, the legislature doesn't have to wait to lose in court. They could, if they wanted to, act on their own to address the inadequate and inequitable way they fund education in Pennsylvania. Where are we in the lawsuit? So again, having filed in 2014, we served a lot of discovery back and forth, over 100,000, more than that at this point, actually, pages of documents. We did over 70 depositions, and we're getting ready for actual trial. We have expert reports. They have expert reports. They tried to moot out some of our families. You know, we did file the case 7 years ago. So the fact that it's taken this long to get to trial means that some of our students have in fact graduated. But we won that because as the judge ruled, it's still of public importance. So while technically moot that the students aren't currently in school, those particular ones, they stay in the case, their families stay in the case. You may have, if you're on our list, you may know about this, but Speaker Cutler tried to exclude our data on racial disparities and filed a motion that said, since your claims are under the Constitution, you can't talk about race, essentially, which we won, because in fact, we want to be able, and we will have experts and witnesses talk about what the impact is, what does this look like at the district level and for students. And it's not just about averages, it's what does this mean for students in specific student groups. And the reality is this has disproportionately impacted our Black and brown students in schools, and we're going to show that, and the judge has allowed that. So that was one piece of our summer. And then also just last week or 2 weeks ago, she granted a motion to update some of the discovery. So we did many of those depositions over a year ago, and updating the discovery, well, it will take us a bit more time, will also allow us to include additional information, for example, relating to COVID over the past year, et cetera. So that's what we've spent our summer on. And now we're gearing up for a trial, which will begin at this point in person in Harrisburg on October 12th. It will also be live streamed. And that's some of the latest developments. What will the other side argue? What have they argued? That Pennsylvania is already a high spender, and that the new formula solved all the problems. It's hard to, well, I'll try not to editorialize too much because I know you're recording this, but I think it's a distraction to compare Pennsylvania to other states across the country. Our case is about our state constitution and what it obligates our state leaders to do for our Pennsylvania students. And we know our students are not getting what they need to succeed. And, in terms of the funding formula, as you know well, having the funding formula is an acknowledgement of funding required to meet some of the challenges of poverty, district sparsity, English learners, et cetera. But the state hasn't actually put the majority of the funding through the formula, so it's certainly not fixed. And the last two is what I would characterize as blame the students, blame the parents. These are outside factors, and schools can't do anything about that. We plan to refute all of this. So we will show that the inequities are dramatic and unacceptable, and the districts with more white students receive more money, and districts with more Black and Latinx students receive less money, and it's not by a little. There are huge gaps. It's huge gaps between what our students have, and that our majority of our 50% of our Black students and 40% of our Latinx students attend Pennsylvania's lowest wealth districts, which are underfunded. So there's this correlation which results in huge disparities in terms of what our students get or do not get. And we will also be showing that, in fact, money matters and all students can learn. We have, I think, some really compelling expert witnesses who will get deep into this, that high quality preschool, small class sizes, highly qualified teachers, culturally relevant curriculum, access to counselors, social workers, things that cost money, have a huge impact on academic outcomes and have a huge impact on our students. We have an expert report that talks about the adequacy gap. So when the legislature set forth, actually separate from the fair funding formula, the legislature earlier had put into law a formula for calculating the resources that schools need so that their students have a shot at reaching state academic standards. They've never done anything with that, or they haven't done anything with that in a long time. But they still have the law in the books that says the state should calculate how much school districts need to reach this target each year, and they haven't done it. So our expert just updated the state's own numbers just to calculate it. So it's a fairly conservative estimate because it doesn't, we'll talk about why it's conservative in a minute, but even take it for what it is. It's $4.6 billion that is the gap between what what we spend now on education in Pennsylvania and what we would need to just to get to that baseline adequacy number. And so, you know, that 277 of 86% of all of our school districts are underfunded. And of those districts, 277 need more than $2,000 per student to adequately support their students' learning needs and graduate them college and career ready. And so altogether, that's $4.6 billion more. If you're interested in knowing what that means in a per district way, these are our petitioner school districts: Lancaster, Wilkes-Barre, William Penn, Shenandoah, Panther Valley. I added Philadelphia, just to see what that is, what's the gap per student. And again, multiply that by the 30 kids in a classroom. That's the gap of what those districts need to just get to adequacy. If you don't see your school district there and you're interested in knowing what your district's adequacy gap is, you can go to fundourschoolspa.org. There it is. And there's an interactive map, and you could click on your district and see what that gap is. That will be part of the evidence, you know, part of our lawsuit. But just to think about what that scale is in terms of what our districts simply don't have. It's about distribution. It's about size of the pie. So again, what Dr. Kelly did, what that, you know, to get to that 4.6 billion is just one, you know, it's just one way to do it. It could likely be higher if you were to factor in, you know, that what he was updating comes from academic standards from 2005. If you updated that, if you took into account the pension cost spike, the charter growth spike, the new Beth weights, you know, special education facilities, you're talking, you know, well, over 4.8 billion. So just to give you a sense of scale. And again, we're not asking the judge to say, all right, legislature, the number's 4.8, but we hope that she does say to the legislature, figure out what that number is and then fund it. So again, we talked about this, but this is, you know, this is about growing the pie. Even some of our shrinking school districts have really high poverty numbers in them. So we want to address hold harmless, but we want to address it as we're growing. So want to point out, and again, I know you know because you've been really helpful in advocacy, but we don't, parallel to the litigation and beyond the litigation, there are legislative opportunities, because ultimately, again, we're the lawyers are saying, here's the legal argument, judge, this is unconstitutional. Order the legislature to fix it. When the legislature has to fix it, how will that, you know, what are the blueprints for that? That's where I think there are advocacy opportunities to work with the legislature to have them primed to do that. And so we've been doing that, again, you know, with you and alongside a lot of other advocacy groups in Pennsylvania to try to advocate for increasing the pie and redistributing it. You know that the governor had introduced a proposal over $1 billion to do just that, which did not pass. What did pass in June 21 was a $200 million increase to basic education funding, $50 million to special ed, $100 million to level up, which our concept with level up was to say, use the fair funding formula, but if you going 200 million at a time, you're never gonna get to districts, the poorest districts having what they need. Drive it, accelerate it, put it through the formula, but to the 20% of districts who are furthest from adequacy. So that was rural, urban, suburban, those districts, those 20% of our poorest districts, 65% of Pennsylvania's Black students, 58% of students in poverty, 64% of our English learners, 35% of our students with disabilities. If the state were to actually put a lot of money into both basic education funding and level up and special ed, like our school districts would be, you know, the formulas themselves make sense, but formulas are only as good as the dollars sent through them. So I do think that there are legislative opportunities, again, to be pushing for increasing what the state spends and how it distributes that. And again, just to mention this, because it will come up, and if you go to legislative meetings or you're in these conversations, I think it's important to just know, you'll hear, oh, but the feds gave the districts so much money, and so the districts have what they need, they can't even spend it, blah, blah, blah. Yes, through COVID stimulus and recovery dollars, the feds did allocate significant dollars across the country, thankfully. Districts need them. Districts desperately need them to be able to reopen this week, next week, etc. But they are temporary. They are one time, and they were told by Pennsylvania's legislative leaders not to spend it on recurring costs. And so this does not address the long-term problems that we have in Pennsylvania. And so while certainly an important influx of dollars, and to our Title I schools, so it was going through Title I, so the schools with greatest need get those dollars. That's great, it's terrific. And it's temporary, and that's not going to accomplish, systemic improvements that we need. But we're hoping that the lawsuit can. And, I guess one advantage of Pennsylvania being so far behind so many other states and having this kind of litigation is that we've been able to benefit from looking at other states that have had successful school funding litigation and seeing that it's brought around more revenue than a state would otherwise have been able to raise, sustained investment. And so not sort of like, ooh, who's the governor? What's the legislature? Like up, down in terms of investing in schools, but sustained investment. And so there's some good research about that. And that it results, it results in an increase in academic achievement and lifetime successes, and money matters, and it has an impact for our students. And I hope that the lawsuit will also be able to accomplish breaking the political impasse over funding, and frankly giving the legislature an excuse to do what I think they know they need to do, which is adequately and equitably fund our schools. So that's our hope. And I'm hoping that you'll all be interested in getting involved with POWER's efforts and with our efforts to, as the case progresses. So, I'll leave it to Michelle and other organizers at POWER to kind of walk through what those opportunities are. But I will just say, if you can fund our schoolspa.org, which is our joint website with the Education Law Center and the Public Interest Law Center. And you'll be able to follow along the updates. Again, when we have the link from the judge, from the court, we'll be able to share that so you can watch along every day of the fall that the trial goes on for. And hopefully you'll also come to court and watch live some of that time as well. If you have specific stories from your school district, from your students, from your children, your grandchildren, whatever, in terms of how money matters, we're interested. We'd love to know your story and to help share your story in the media as this plays out. And I guess the last thing I'll say before I turn it back to Rochelle, besides thank you, is that I'll also just put a quick plug. In addition to fair funding, the Education Law Center is also working hard on back to school. And so separate from our fair funding, but related to our fair funding advocacy, because of course, many of our underfunded districts are not providing students with what they need. And so we're about to send out a back to school compendium with a lot of kind of user-friendly, I hope, tools on how to enroll in school, what to do if the school district is requiring certain documentation, how to help English learners, etc. And so if you go to our website next week, elc-pa.org, we'll have a lot of, I think, helpful tools for you. If in addition to fair funding, you're also working on the sort of very granular pieces of getting students into school this fall. So with that, I say thank you and turn it back, I think, to Rochelle.
Thank you, Deborah. I'll take it. We
John.
had several questions about adequacy, and we're going to take the next 10 or 12 minutes for questions here. Several questions about adequacy. I think you covered it quite well. I guess the question I have that I'm interpreting is that Professor Kelly used a formula to calculate adequacy. Is that formula generally accepted by the state, or there's one question. And then when you say 4.6 billion, Professor Kelly mentioned that. Is that just added on to all of the current spending by the state, or is it just basic education funding?
His 4.6 is basic education funding.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm not, because I was doing screen share, I wasn't seeing all the questions. So now I'm trying to look at this and answer and try to answer what I can, or if you've distilled it. But the question about that formula, it's still on the books. Is it widely accepted? The legislature hasn't followed it in a number of years. So it was a way that, under Rendell, that was used to calculate, to get a target, to get what do we want to spend. It's my opinion that it was a choice that the legislature made not to keep that up, because if they don't know what that number is, they don't have to meet those goals. I think that's a huge problem. We need to know what our goal is so we can aim for it. Nobody thinks that they're going to come up with an additional 4.6 billion. But they could have come close with the governor's proposal, by the way, and they have that money in the rainy day fund. They could have come close. Nobody thinks it's 4.6, but at least knowing what you're shooting for, what's your goal? What do we need? And again, that's the adequacy line. That's like the baseline, taking into account there are different ways you could measure it. There are lots of different ways you could measure it. Is it the best? Is it the worst? It's a way.
Well, one of the things that you had mentioned, that this is applying to basic education funding. What is the current basic education funding? 7 billion?
I have this. Sharon's on too. She may know it right off the top of her head because she's better than I am with numbers. 6.55 billion.
6.55, and we're saying from this formula that we're way, way below that if we need to add 4.6 billion to that. Okay.
We're way, way below that. That's right. And do you want me to just try to look through? How do you want to? Somebody asked about an appeal. If I'm being realistic, whichever side doesn't win is likely appealing this to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Okay. Can you tell us about the judge?
Judge Conjubilier, she's a Commonwealth court judge. I will say it's rare. So this is a trial, right? We have witnesses, direct examination, cross-examination. It's a trial, but it's not in the normal, our trial courts in Pennsylvania. You have Court of Common Pleas. That's generally the trial court. Then you have the appellate level, which is either the Superior Court or the Commonwealth Court. Commonwealth Court is if it involves the government, and then the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And so the trial court is normally the Court of Common Pleas, but because we're suing the state, the trial court becomes Commonwealth Court. So generally this court hears appeals from the courts of common pleas in this case, and in other cases like the gerrymandering case you may know about from a few years ago. The trial court in these cases against the state is Commonwealth Court. So far, we feel good. We are excited to present our case finally. Procedurally, we've kind of gone up and down. So we first filed the case and the Commonwealth Court said, or the other side said, this isn't justiciable. This is a political question. It's not for the courts to decide. And we appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and we said, we think interpreting the state constitution actually is something for the court to decide. And there are judicially manageable standards. You could look at state standards to determine how to do this. So we've been up and down. And I think, we want to be really, it's not a jury trial. We're trying to convince the judge, and we want to be as respectful and focused on, trying this case in front of her. She is not, in terms of advocacy for our partners like you at POWER, she's not the, focus the energies on the legislature. They're the one, the lawyers will be focused on Judge Conjubilier and advocating, trying our case. And we hope that our partners, our advocates, will be focused on the legislature so that they're, because in fact, they're the ones responsible.
Right.
They're the ones who have not met their constitutional duty.
Right. So our advocacy is focused on the legislature. Another question was, how can we be confident that a solution that comes about if we win the trial is truly fair and adequate?
We have to believe that, when a judge, state court, judge makes an order, that it will be followed. And in other states, when it hasn't, then they've gone back to court.
Okay.
So I think, you may be hearing presentations from me for the foreseeable, for years ahead in terms of where we are in the court. But I will say in other situations, Republican legislatures have received court orders and followed them.
Okay. There is a question about time frame. So basically you're saying there really is no time frame to require a solution. Do you have anything more to say about that?
Well, usually I'm asked sort of what's the time frame of the lawsuit, which is really hard to tell. I wouldn't have guessed 7 years ago to get to trial.
Wow.
But here we are. I think, trial will be this fall. I think it will last through most of the fall. We have a lot of witnesses. They have a lot of witnesses. And I think, the judge is interested in hearing all of the evidence. And so we'll, that will probably take most of the fall when she makes her, then after the trial, there'll be post-trial motions from both sides. Hopefully she'll make her decision soon thereafter, because it'll be so clear that they're unconstitutionally, we'll see. And then again, if I'm being realistic, somebody will appeal, and it will go up, and then it will come back to, we'll see. Again, I think the case does provide, some parallel advocacy opportunities with the legislature to act in good faith now and not wait. I also think the lawsuit presents opportunities to, when we win, to have additional leverage to get the legislature to, adequately and equitably fund our schools.
Okay. They're connected to that. Someone was asking, well, which legislators have you gotten that question before? Do you have an answer from your perspective?
I mean, the answer is all of them. I guess the answer is also thinking about, there's sort of two tactics. There are many tactics, I suppose, but, thinking about who's on appropriations. I also think, working with the governor who wants education to be his legacy, and thinking about what role he could play in introducing another budget, this year, and what that might include. Hopefully, a big ask that the state certainly has the dollars, if it wanted to allocate it to education.
And maybe this will be the second to last question, Deborah, but talking about the governor, he will be making another budget proposal. Has the Education Law Center analyzed that at all? Anything to say about Governor Wolf's
we
future
were supportive of his you mean his last year proposal, the 1.4?
He'll be making another one before he leaves office?
Yeah. He will. He will be in February giving his budget address, and we hope that, while a respondent in this case has publicly talked about the importance of funding education, and we hope he'll have a large ask of the legislature. Ultimately, it gets negotiated. He proposes in February his budget ask, and the legislature negotiates it in the spring and passes a budget at the end of June when it works. We have a $4.6 billion need at least in basic education funding. Last year, they allocated $200 million to BEF, $100 million to Level Up. They could do better.
Yeah, okay. Last question, I think, is does the New Jersey case in which property tax was declared unconstitutional as a funding source provide any precedent for this case?
We definitely look to New Jersey because Abbott, their fair funding case has been ongoing since I think the late 70s in multiple, but it's what we see from Abbott and what we see is that it resulted in the legislature, the state legislature of New Jersey, continuing to invest in schools. And actually that case, you know, it's pre-K, it's K-12, it's facilities, and it's worked. And so we do look to that. We actually, there's an education law center in New Jersey. We spun off, you know, we opened in Philadelphia in 1975, and then as like the Pennsylvania office, and then later incorporated as our own organization. But we have partnered with ELC New Jersey to learn from them, and to, you know, we have a really different legislature and a different court.
Mhm.
But yes, we're, you know, sharing information, and frankly, sharing information with the litigators who've tried fair funding cases all over the country.
Okay.
And you know, learning their lessons. And one of their lessons is how helpful it was to have partners like you, who could be doing some mobilization while the lawyers are in, you know, focused on court.
Okay, so Deborah, thanks for putting up with our rapid fire questions. And we could go on another 2 hours, but because of time, we'll cut off the questions here. And I am going to pass the baton over to Rochelle.
All right. Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Rochelle Nichols Solomon, and I'm a member of POWER Philadelphia, and I'm on the local education team as well as the statewide team. Deborah, thank you so much for a very informative, rapid fire presentation. And we just want to let folks know, we will, again, we're recording this. We will get Deborah's slides, so they will be available. And also, we will look in the chat, and if there's some burning questions that didn't get answered, we'll get to Deborah and get those questions answered. So thank you, Deborah, so much. Deborah has really talked about the what. And we recognized putting this meeting together. I do want to acknowledge both Beth Reeves and John Barnett, who we've worked closely together in planning this, and then with the POWER staff. So I want to thank those folks. But she's given us the what, and we knew that there was a real continuum in terms of knowledge and understanding about this issue. Some people are just coming into this. Some folks have been sloshing through this for the long time. I've been sloshing in it for a long time, and I'm always learning something new. So really, really do appreciate that and finding that common ground of information. What we want to do now is spend the last 30 minutes. We now have 68 people. So we had 75. I think that was our highest. We've got 68 people. Hang in there, folks, because what we want to do now is just spend some time talking about the now what. She did the what, now what. And that now what is what we are thinking about, how we're thinking about next steps, and what we as POWER will do. And then we want to actually break into some small groups and give you an opportunity to react to some of the things you heard, as well as give some suggestions or thoughts about actions that we might take. So I had a slide, but we don't have them up, but it's a quote from Frederick Douglass, which is one of my favorite, from 1857, where he says, "Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will." So to Deborah's question, or to the question to Deborah, what if the legislature is not going to just roll over? They represent power. And so we understand, and that's a real premise of power, is to build power. What we want to do is ultimately have the strength and the will and the muscle to bring about the change in a state that has one of the most inequitable school funding systems in the nation. So here we are. So as many of you know, POWER has been organizing to ensure that the state's basic education budget is distributed through the fair funding formula. And Deborah talked about that a number of times. Through our work, we really seek to achieve three things: the elimination of all racial disparity in the funding of school districts in Pennsylvania, adequacy of funding for all Pennsylvania school districts. Deborah talked about the pie. We agree that pie needs to be much bigger. Also to achieve excellence in education opportunity for all Pennsylvania's children. With this in mind, POWER fully, wholeheartedly supports the plaintiffs in the Pennsylvania school funding lawsuit. As you've heard, the trial for this is going to begin on October the 12th. I can't imagine, I could hear a sigh of relief because initially it was supposed to start like in a couple of weeks, and it got pushed back and everybody was like, whew, thank goodness. So it is now set to start on October 12th. Don't really know how much time, but maybe 6 to 10 weeks, perhaps. Could be more, but 6 to 10 weeks. We'll be in the fall. And so that's going to be happening. During this time, we in POWER are committed to having a sustained presence in Harrisburg. That is, that we are committed to showing up on the same day each week in Harrisburg at the court case, at the trial. And POWER leaders from Philadelphia, from Metro Philadelphia, from Lancaster and Lehigh are going to rotate organizing a cadre of individuals and leaders to go into the courtroom and bear witness to the trial, and then to do something like a muted but powerful vigil on the courthouse steps. We are there to show our support for the plaintiffs and this lawsuit. We are not there to demand from the judge, she's the judge, right? But we are there to show our enthusiastic and ongoing support, and we will have that sustained presence. But in addition, while the school funding lawsuit, as Deborah has explained, doesn't specifically call for a particular solution, POWER Interfaith is going to continue to specifically demand the full use of the fair funding formula. And so over these weeks, when we're in Harrisburg, we will also, in some instances, conduct visits to the General Assembly. We're planning to try to organize ourselves so we are there when both the House and the Senate are in session, so that we can split off and actually go and visit legislatures and talk to them about this work. So during this period, over this 6 to 10 weeks or whatever it's going to be, we're also going to be organizing local activities, that is locally and where we live, not in Harrisburg, not at the courthouse, not at the Capitol, but then we will organize local activities that call attention to the trial. We're going to visit home legislatures, offices, mass phone calls, postcard mailings, et cetera, in our regions. Even during, Deborah talked about that the case will be streamlined. So there might be watch groups that are watching and spinning out information. The description of the witnesses that are going to be called and the questioning, it's going to be juicy. And so maybe this is our new soap opera, to like hang in there and watch this streamlined case and then pass that word and get that word out. And also we plan at least once during this period of time, 6 to 10 weeks, we keep saying, but it's all to be determined, that we would do one assembly, one large rally gathering on the steps of the Capitol, not the courthouse, but the Capitol, around the full and fair funding. So some type of rally. This work is again aimed at the state's political leaders, and it's essential. We don't know what's going to be the outcome of the trial, but what we do know is that in the event of a positive ruling in the trial, we need to be prepared to exercise our power to push the General Assembly to respond with a full, just, equitable solution without delay. We know they can drag their feet and it could be 5 years. I have grandchildren now that weren't born when this case was introduced, right? And we don't want it when they're graduating from high school for this to be settled. So we really are going to know that we have to push the General Assembly to respond with an equitable solution without delay. And what we do know is in the event of a negative outcome from the trial, we will need to be prepared to carry on the fight for justice. So at the core of all of this work that we will be doing is base building. So lots of relational talking, one-on-ones, expanding our base, further educating the public and leaders, and building that muscle to influence the legislature. So those are just some general high-level ideas that we are talking about. We have a planning team that's working on this. We have a statewide team we'll be going to in a few weeks. And so we'll be coming out with some concrete ideas and specific ideas, dates, names, all those kinds of things. But what I want to do now is to stop. It's 8:11 and we have 60 people with us, and we're going to break into small groups. And that's going to give you an opportunity to talk with one another. Really what we want to do is to have you get into your small group. We want you to introduce yourself. We want you to just share real quickly one thing that stood out for you, what really resonated with you in all that you've heard this evening, and then to talk about ideas that you might have for what we might do around this court case and around the legislature. So I'm going to stop now, and Nathan is going to divvy us up into these small groups. We're going to spend about 10 minutes in your small group. If you could just have one person volunteer when we come back to put some high-level action piece in the chat so we have a record of that. We're not going to ask people to report out, but to just put in the chat when we come back in some high-level discussion in terms of the idea that might have emerged in your discussion. And then we'll have a closing faith grounding, and we'll end for the evening. So Nathan, if you can break us into those virtual small groups.
Okay, here we go. You're gonna get a notice on your laptop or phone. Just respond. Here we go.
Rochelle told me to hang up when they went into small groups, so I figured I would just see if you needed anything else from me, Nathan, and then.
No, everything's cool, and I will be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. This was so helpful, and I think that people were really interested.
Great, awesome. Thank you so much. Be well.
Thank you.
So we have 8 minutes. What folks would put in chat, maybe some of the ideas or thoughts that came up in your breakout group, that would be appreciated. We're down to 44 people, but thank you 44 people that stayed in. I think it's been a good briefing. So at this point, we really want to wrap up. Does anybody want to just make a comment about the briefing or about your small group conversation, since we do still have a few minutes? Nick?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that one of the things we talked about was this adequacy issue. And we haven't talked about the implications, which are that we need more money there. Now, I don't know that the legislature would decide to spend it on education if there was just more money coming into the general fund. But that certainly is an issue, and people, need to pay if they're wanting the public good. They have to pay for the public good, and people need to know about that, not just think of taxes as a decreasing of their own personal income, but an investment in the common good.
Other reactions? Thank you, Nick.
There's some people who are commenting in the chat.
This is Nancy from Newtown. I just want to thank you for all the work you did, and Deborah, because this is one of the best Zooms, and I have been Zoomed, that I have attended in a long time. You have raised my knowledge and my spirits that this is really possible. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you all for being here. That's good to hear. Other reactions?
I also agree with Nancy, but I also want to say that I think that a lot more of this information should be on social media. I don't know, maybe I just don't see it. Maybe it's there and I don't know it. The op-ed should be put up, perhaps. I don't know how much of it could be put up, but it would be wonderful if more people could see it that way, because so many people are on social media.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is Jennifer from United Church of Christ at Valley Forge, and I just want to say thank you for putting the PowerPoint together and for sharing it with us, because I think it's going to really help me explain to my congregation members, like update them with what's going on, and explain it in a pretty straightforward, simple way.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of related to this point about, one thing that Power can do is making sure that we're getting information out there in all kinds of ways, both locally and statewide. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think, and ways that it's digestible, because I do think that, there's a lot of swirl, there's a lot going on, but to do that in ways that people can talk to one another about it and take things apart would be helpful. Other thoughts, ideas? Sandra?
I would like to direct to Ruth Yeiser, who had a good idea from Fair Funding PA.
Actually, it's Fair Districts PA.
Fair Districts. I'm sorry. I was just reading the
Fair Districts PA. For those of you that don't know, it's an anti-gerrymandering group, and we've been working for years on redistricting reform. And we have an email list of over 60,000 people. And those 60,000 people, a good chunk of them come from what we call polling place outreach, where we have sent volunteers to the polls, where they talk to voters after they vote, 90-second elevator speech about why this issue is important. The voter signs a petition, to support fair funding. It's not a real petition, but it gives us their email address, and then we can reach them through our action network with updates. And it also, because we're at the polls, even if we don't get a street address, we know where they vote, so we know who their legislators are. So when we want to do actions that target certain legislators, we have, we have the information on the people in that district, so we can set them up to contact their legislators. So that's something that has been very, I don't want to say it's been effective for Fair Districts PA, because we failed miserably in getting our legislation through, but it certainly raised the level of awareness about gerrymandering, about redistricting, and people are certainly paying attention to the redistricting process this year in a way that they did not pay attention to in 2011.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. Any other comments? So So one of the things we do at Power is we start our meetings with a faith grounding and we end our meeting with a faith grounding. So on behalf of the planning group and Power's staff, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I want to thank you for being 44 participants that stayed until the very end. And I'm going to do the faith grounding that will send us on our way. Just before I do that, I do want to say we will circle back. We will have information. We will be in touch. So we're not going away and we will be sharing it. So we really look forward to working with all of you, being part of our base building, being part of our acting, both having a presence in Harrisburg and in your local communities and being part of this work. So the faith grounding that I'm going to end with is a poem by Lucille Clifton, and it's called Blessing the Boats. It's Blessing the Boats by Lucille Clifton at St. Mary's, parenthesis. May the tide that is entering even now, the lip of our understanding, carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water waving forever. And may you, in your innocence, sail through this to that. Thank you again, and we will be in touch. We Power always does an evaluation meeting after this. And so if you want to hang out for a few more minutes, we'll have a quick evaluation of this meeting, and you're welcome to stay for that. But if not, we'll see you the next time. Thank you again. Good evening.